Hi, this is Maria Williams. In today's video, I'm going to show you how I made these two ornament cards with the Seasons of Whimsy stamp set, which is a hostess stamp set, which means you'd have to have a Stampin' Up! Party to get it. So here's another good reason to have a party. Here's the first card that I made using this stamp set. I made it for a card class, and it's a fairly simple card, but there's a lot of gold embossing and a little bit of glitter that unfortunately you can't see. Here's the Seasons of Whimsy stamp set. The sentiment came from this other stamp set, which is the Holly Berry Happiness. And for this card, I used a bow from a die set that's discontinued. So for the second card, I'm using this bow from the Mini Treat Thinlit set, Mini Treat bag, excuse me. I've already pre-cut all the pieces for my card. I'm using a card base made out of Berry Burst and a panel from Lemon Lime Twist, and then later on I'm going to be using Pool Party to do a little stamping. And I'm going to get started with the card base. It's just a standard card base, so a piece of cardstock that's 5.5 by 11, scored at 4 1/4. And I'm taking the White Craft ink with the stamp from the Seasons of Whimsy stamp set that is like a sparkler. And I'm inking up the stamp and just basically stamping around the edge of the front of the card. And I decided that I wanted the corners to be pretty much the same. I did want everything to be a little bit symmetrical. So I went ahead and did the corners, and then on the small sides I just stamped the sparkler once in between the two corners, and then for the longer sides I stamped in the middle and then stamped two more little bits of the sparkler in between. I'm going to set this aside to dry since the craft ink takes a little bit of time to dry, and I'm going to start working on my front panel that has the ornaments on it. To make sure that my ornaments are equally spaced, instead of stamping them individually, I'm going to go ahead and lay them out on my white piece of shimmer white cardstock that I'm using, and then I'm going to pick them all up with a block at the same time. I'm just placing the strip of cardstock that I'm going to use for the sentiment below the ornaments just to make sure that it's going to fit. When I do this, I like to use a large block so that when I stamp the images, I can see the entire panel that I'm stamping onto. But if you don't have one that's as large as the one that I'm going to use, you could definitely use a smaller one. For example, that E size block would be large enough, but I'm going to use this one that's a little bit larger to pick up my stamps. Since I'm going to be heat embossing my images, I've already prepped my piece of cardstock with my embossing buddy, and now I'm taking my Versamark ink, inking up my stamps really well, and then I'm just going to stamp my images onto the cardstock, applying some nice pressure. Since I've got 3 stamps, there's a fair amount of surface area that needs to hit my cardstock, so I'm going to make sure that I apply really nice pressure. And then I'm just going to take my gold embossing powder and sprinkle it onto the cardstock and heat it up with my heat tool. To make sure that I get as little warping as possible, I'm going to make sure that my heat tool is nice and hot. So I just hold my hand a few inches away until I feel like it's getting really hot, and then I apply the heat to my paper, to my cardstock. As I mentioned before, I'm going to be using Pool Party, Lemon Lime Twist, and Berry Burst as my colors for the ornaments. And I'm just going to make sure that there's a little pool of ink in each one of the ink pads. So I'm squeezing the Berry Burst one since I didn't have one. And then I'm just going to take a water brush and add a little bit of water to that pool of color and watercolor each one of the ornaments. This seems to me like it's the easiest way to color these ornaments because they have so much detail that if you were trying to get in between all the embossing lines with anything else like a watercolor pencil or with marker, it would be really difficult. So this way you don't have to be really careful. The embossing acts like a little bit of a barrier to make sure you don't go outside the lines, and because they're watercolored, you don't have to have perfect and really uniform coverage. It just gives it a little bit more of a whimsical look. To clean my water brush, all I have to do is get a paper towel and squeeze some water out, and then just run the water brush back and forth on the paper towel until I see no more color coming off. And then once it's clean, I can just go ahead and move on to the next color. If you're not using watercolor paper, be careful not to add too much water at any given time onto your cardstock. If you feel like the color is too light, you're better off letting it dry and then coming back in with another coat of the same color. You could also, if you wanted it to dry a little bit faster, add a little bit of alcohol to your water, but in this particular case, I'm just using water by itself. If you were to use alcohol only, it might dry a little bit too fast and then you wouldn't have enough time to work the color around the ornament. I'm moving on to my sentiment now, so I'm just taking my little strip of Berry Burst cardstock. It's cut to about 5/8 of an inch. I've prepped it with my embossing buddy. I'm stamping it with Versamark ink, adding some white embossing powder, and once again heating up my heat tool and melting my powder with the heat tool. To add a little bit of interest, I'm just going to snip off the right side of my strip. I'm going to do it at an angle with my Stampin' Up snips. They're so nice and sharp. Love these scissors. And then I'm going to work out the placement on my white panel. But before I do that, I'm going to stamp some of these little, I don't know what to call them, sunbursts. They're not sunbursts, they're sparks, I guess. They're not really snowflakes, but I think they could pass. So I'm stamping them in Pool Party. And on the first card I made, I just inked up the stamp and stamped directly onto the panel. But for this one, I am stamping off and then stamping onto my panel. And I'm doing this in a very random pattern without overthinking it. And then I'm going to add a little bit of glitter. I'm adding some dazzling diamonds, and unfortunately in the pictures and even in the video it doesn't seem like it's very clear, but in real life it really is sparkly. I'm using the fine tip glue pen, and I want a teeny tiny amount of glue, otherwise it'll just create a mess. So I'm just barely dabbing a tiny little bit of glue, and then I'm going to add the dazzling diamonds using a coffee filter to collect the excess. This is going to take a few seconds to dry, so in the meantime I'm just going to take my coffee filter and fold it in half and funnel the rest of the dazzling diamonds right back into the container. While my dazzling diamonds and glue are drying, I'm going to work on the inside of my card. So as always, I'm going to prep it with the embossing buddy, and I have already cleaned my stamp really well, and I'm stamping it with Versamark ink onto the corner of my card, and I want to make sure the whole thing shows up so that you can really see that it's a sparkler. The sentiment I'm using is from the Holly Berry Happiness stamp set, and it says best wishes for the season. So with the sparkler there, I feel like it makes you think of New Year's, so the card is good for all the way from Christmas through the New Year. On the first card I made, I stamped the sentiment with the green ink that I was using, which in that case was Pear Pizzazz, but because the lemon lime twist is so light, I decided to go ahead and stamp the sentiment with the Berry Burst instead. That's all I'm doing for the inside of my card, so I'm going to go ahead and attach it to the inside of my card with some snail adhesive. The Seasons of Whimsy stamp set does have a stamp that is a line with a little bow on it that you can use to stamp at the top of the ornaments, like it's what's holding them up. And that's what I used for my original card. But in this second card, I'm going to do something a little bit different. to use that stamp from the stamp set, you would have to use the Stamp-O-Majig, and I think that this is a little bit easier. So I'm just taking a T-square ruler and lining it up, and the reason I have flipped my panel upside down is that if I don't, when I draw the lines, the tip of my marker would hit the T-square and I may not get the color all the way to the edge of my panel. So this way I can make sure that my line is going to run all the way to the edge of the panel. Then I'm taking the box of the stamp set so that I can use the image as reference, and then just basically duplicating it freehand. I've already die cut the bow from the mini treat bag Thinlits die set, and I just need to figure out the placement before I attach my sentiment. So I've just kind of set it up there, make sure that I've got enough room on the left side, and I'm attaching that strip with some dimensionals. I'm going to flip it to the back and trim off my excess. And then I'm just going to use a glue dot to attach the bow. But I did double check that the sentiment was adhered properly, and I realized that my dimensionals didn't go far enough to the edge, and the edge was kind of loose over there. So I went ahead and snuck in another dimensional underneath. I'm attaching the lemon line twist piece of cardstock to my card base just with some snail adhesive, and then I'm going to attach my ornament panel with some dimensionals, and I have a lot of edges that I need to use up, so I'm just cutting them while they're still attached to the backer and then placing them on my panel, and then I will remove all the backers at one time and center my focal panel onto the lemon lime twist panel. And lastly, as I mentioned before, I'm just going to take a glue dot. I'm going to pick it up with my paper piercer and put it on the back of the bow and make sure that none of that glue dot is sticking out from the edges, and then I'm just going to place it onto my card. So here's my finished card and the card that I completed previously. I wish you could see the sparkle from the dazzling diamonds. Please leave me a comment and let me know which card you liked better. And if you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. See you next time. If you would like to see more pictures or purchase any of the products used in this video, please visit my blog at mariascardsandmore.com. Thanks for watching.